My name is Ruth from Studio 300, and welcome to Studio 300 Presents Embroidery Logo Design. Now, you may have noticed that we got a new logo in the past year, which is gorgeous, but what you might not have noticed is that we also got a lot of new embroidery resources down here in the studio. So we got 20,000 plus embroidery designs that you can actually use. We got a new embroidery machine, the Brother PE900, which stitches like a dream. And then we also got a digitizing software, which is actually what you need to make your own embroidery designs. So we got the Embrilliance Stitch Artist 1, and I just thought it would be a perfect way to start the new year by combining all of these new things and showing you how to make your own logo within the Stitch Artist app. All right, so let's get started. The first thing you're going to want to do is actually open the Embrilliance app, which is going to be under the Applications menu. It's going to have this yellow background with a needle peeking through. And I'm actually going to just resize the window real quick. I don't like to full size it because I do like to see the desktop underneath and just access all my applications there at the bottom. So you can see that says Untitled 1, that's our design. We're just going to want to make sure we save that now so that we can keep saving it in the same location and just choose the desktop so we know exactly where it is and name it something simple like Embroidery Logo Design. So this whole program is Embrilliance, but what we just want is the Stitch Artist. We have Stitch Artist 1, so if you mouse over and see this where it says Create Designs, that's where you want to be. And then if you see this image button over here, you can click this to import a design, either a JPEG or a PNG. It'll go to Finder, and then you just need to navigate to where your design is. There are many ways to resize your design, but be careful if you just grab from the side here, it'll skew unevenly. So I'm going to Command Z and actually grab from the corner, and that's when it becomes scalable. If you need to grab it, you want to grab it from this green handle here and move it around. It has to be this handle. If you try to grab it from anywhere else, it just won't move. And that's to keep your design from changing as you start adding stitches. If you know the exact size you need, you can actually toggle off the Stitch Artist button. I know I need inches, so I'm actually going to switch to that instead of the metric system and just change this to 4 1/8, and then that will scale it down equally on all sides. And then I can move on to changing the hoop size because I want to make sure that the design stays within the hoop. So I'm going to click on this folder where we have our option menu, and then the hoops are all available here. We see different sizes. One that's commonly going to be used, if you scroll down, you can see it. Oh, right here we have 100 by 100. That's going to be like a 4x4 hoop, which is good for probably an embroidery, but I'm just over that 4-inch limit, so I'm going to choose 130 by 180, which is our 5x7 hoop, and now that just automatically changes here. Now that everything is sized correctly, we can see our image is over here, and this is where we'll see our design appearing as we work on it. So if we go back to the Stitch Artist, there are a couple ways to start building. We can draw with points. If it's a simple design, we can try using the wand tool. I'll press 1 to kind of zoom in. And then if I just click each form, you'll notice on the right side that they start just kind of appearing as lines. So that means these are just empty shapes right now, just outlining each form. And it's doing it pretty quickly. You can see it looks pretty simple. But if we take a closer look, I'm just going to hit the number 2 and we can get a little closer look at what's actually happened here. I'm just going to unclick the wands, and then if I click, I can actually manipulate each point, and you can see that things aren't exactly lined up. The image isn't as crisp as it could be, so the automatic magic wand just didn't make the forms as neat as I wanted them, and it's just going to take a long time to get them as neat as I want them. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete them and show you how to actually start building your form with just drawing points by hand. The points tool is very similar to any pen tool you would find in like Photoshop or Illustrator. If I click, I can just put down a point. If I hold Shift and click, I can put down a cusp, which means that one side of the point can be curved while the other one can be straight. And then if I add if I do Command click, I can add a line, and then I can close it by hitting this red circle, and that closes the shape. And then if I want to manipulate the points, I can just kind of click and drag them, If I toggle this button, I can actually change the Bezier handles. That's what these things are called. So I can actually change the curve that's going into and out of the cusp. You can see that I can change this and the cusp is not changing. Whereas if I change at a regular point, you can see it's related. It acts like a seesaw. That's what a regular point will do. And then a line is just a line. So like the side that's going into the regular point is still curved, but the one that's just a line and a cusp between, that is just a straight line. So give yourself a chance to play around and kind of figure out what these points do, how they interact, and how you're going to need to make your logo based on like the shapes you need. I'm just going to delete this and then start from the top. And then just hold Command, click, Command, click, Command, click. I'm staying outside the shape because I decided I don't actually want to do all of those tiny little windows that we have. The logo is, based off of our building. So those are all the windows across our gorgeous building. But it is tedious. I did that previously where I made every individual shape, but I'm actually just going to make a few basic shapes for each color, and then I'm going to go in and add lines for all of those intersections to kind of give it more dimension. So I like to be pretty precise. I'm just going to keep fiddling until I get the shape really as I want it. Make sure kind of everything is parallel and straight where I need it to be before then I can start on my next shape. And I'm actually first going to change the color because this is just going to help differentiate the shapes as you move on, and that'll be the fill color ultimately. And then again, I'm just going to hold Command and click away till I get the shape that I need, making sure there's overlap between these two shapes, kind of getting them right there so that they butt right up against each other. And then that seam will then be hidden when I add the outlines after all is said and done. If I'm just adding this to a shirt, though, I might not actually change the colors from the blue to the orange to the green. Part of the reason for having each color be a different shape is also because I can change the direction of the stitches. Embroidery is kind of all about just adding dimension with the directionality of stitches and like how dense they are and what pattern fill you use. So this next shape is actually part of the, in front of our building, we have this walkway, this covered walkway. So, I'm going to break it up into several shapes. So I have one going this direction, one going that direction to kind of symbolize that overhang. And then these will just go up and down because that's just how the pillars hold up that overhang. So once again, I'm just going to start holding Command and clicking. And I'm actually going to speed this part up because it's just the same. You're just building up your forms. Eventually it'll become intuitive. It's a little bit hard to learn, especially if you haven't, used a design software like Photoshop or Illustrator. But eventually it'll get easier, and for now we can just move on to the more exciting part where we're adding stitches to those shapes. So you can see this is the first one we added, and if we see over here where all the different stitches, right now it's a design without stitches. We can do manually, a run, a fill, satin column, satin border, applique, motif, cross stitch, freestanding, motif, stippled. But we're just going to choose fill because that's the most basic way to fill a bunch of stitches into a wide area. I'm just going to change the color on this shape real quick to that kind of nice deep blue. So as soon as we add the stitches, we can see kind of the impact it's going to have. So we're just going to that looks nice. And as soon as I click on fill, those stitches will be generated. That's what a digitizing software is. We're not manually adding the stitches like they once did in the yonder days. It automatically generates them. We can change the direction, but every stitch is just kind of mathematically calculated and added. And with every change I make, those stitches are just automatically being recalculated. I want them to be, perpendicular to these windows because that's kind of how I want the sky to just go into the windows. That's kind of how I want this logo to sit and how I think the dimensionality makes sense. I can also change the start and stop points, which is where the needle will begin and end the shape. If I was just going top down, I could start over here and then start the orange shape here at the top. But usually you want to consider a left to right, top to bottom approach. And with the layout of these windows, it just makes sense to me to start in the left corner and then move right. Now that we've added a fill, we have different settings over here to choose from. I want to change the density, so I just want to change this from 4 to 5 points. You really want to never be less than 4 points. So just put the stitches too close together. And then you can also change the pattern. The base pattern is always tatami, like the tatami mats in Japan, but you can change it. There's a variety of stitch options, and you can just see how creative you can get with the options available to you. You can even have like a scaly figure, or you could use waves if you need a water feature in your logo. There's a variety of options to be really creative. If you choose none, that's just going to be like a satin stitch for a smaller area. It just doesn't work here, so I'm going to stick with tatami. There's also other options here for like the length of each stitch and reverse, but you really don't need to change any of these settings unless you're really experienced and you know what you're doing. We also have pull compensation over here, which is really important, but I'll talk about that a little later. Now, if we click over here, we have the underlay. So that's the stitches that lay down a rough shape underneath to keep your top stitches from sinking into the fabric or stretching your fabric too much in one direction. Contour and perpendicular are already checked, but if I'm doing this and putting it on a knit, I'm also going to add diagonal since the fabric is a lot more prone to stretching. And if you look at the shape right now, you can see how dense it is. Whereas if I just unclick diagonal, you just have the perpendicular lines that are going, perpendicular to these stitches on top. And then if you unclick that, you just get the contour, which is an outline, and then you have nothing. So you have no support. If you have no underlaying, the stitches could get lost right in the fabric. So you add that contour, which defines the shape, keeps that edge nice and neat, and then you add that perpendicular. It gives it something, the stitches to sit onto, and then the diagonal just gives you extra strength, making sure nothing sinks into the fabric. Now I can move on to my next shape, going over here to my layers, and I can click fill. Just want to change that density real quick to 5 point, and then I want to change the direction of the fill. The nice thing about these yellow handles is you can kind of just drop them anywhere and it'll jump automatically to the edge because the pattern has to go across the entire shape. There is some perspective in these windows, so I'm just trying to get the average between the windows, and I think that looks good to me. And now I can move on to changing the start and stop. I know I want to start, over here because that's where the blue one ends, but I could try to end over here. But that means that then the green shape, I would have to go right to left. So I am just going to stop in the same spot and then just make sure that the diagonal is checked. And I'm just going to, again, speed through the green because it's just the same process over and over. That's a lot of what digitizing is, just repeating each step, adding fill, changing the direction, making sure everything is just so you have a successful design. I do have to change the start and stop points just to make sure everything flows smoothly, and I'm not exactly sure where I want this to end. If I end up here, it'll be an easier jump to the F. I know for sure I want, the start point off to the left, but if I end the stop point up next to the F, there seems to be something happening with this last stitch line where it's like skipping kind of half the row. So I think I'll just end down here and keep that line nice and clean. Now everything on this base layer is finally going the direction I want. Everything looks good. So I'm just going to make sure everything has the same settings. I just need to click and circle. There's not like a click and drag that you would normally see in like Photoshop with the select box with the marching ants. Instead, you just kind of have to awkwardly click and circle and try to get all of the objects that you need. Now with everything safely selected, I'm just going to change everything and then change it back. So that way I know that all of the objects are going to have the same 5-point density. Click and unclick diagonal, so they'll all have that underlay. And now if I click on each object, I can see, okay, 5-point diagonal, 5-point diagonal, again, diagonal, again, diagonal. So everything we change changed all of the things so all of the objects have the same settings now. Now I'm going to make sure my last shape is selected before I get started with the next part of this design, because where I'm at in the design tree, the next shape gets added in after. So I'm going to go back to draw with points and start filling in all these gaps between the windows and the different elements. I wouldn't want to add these lines after, say, the orange, because I need them to cover the gaps between the forms and define each of these lines between the windows and the pillars. They would just get lost under the green if that's where they were at within the layers. With all that being said, I'm just going to get started. Again, command clicking, drawing these points, but instead of closing the shape, I'm actually just going to press enter and then start the next shape, because these are just going to stay lines. They're not going to be complete shapes like we were working with before. And I'm just going to keep in mind that I'm working, left, right, top to bottom, and just repeating the process. Command click, enter, and then draw with points again, command point, enter, and just doing that over and over again until all of these lines are filled out. Before we get too far, I do want to change the color of the white to some shade of off-white. I could choose to do a run since these are, technically just lines, but you can kind of see how thin that is. It's not really going to get thicker than that, even though the lines, they are small, but they're not that small. So I'm going to change it to a satin stitch. It looks a lot wider. It is just like stitches perpendicular to each other, stacked on top of each other. And I can make this a lot smaller, down to 1 millimeter wide. It's still a little wider than our reference photo, but it looks a lot better. It's going to look a lot more crisp and finished, and I can just kind of fiddle around with it until it looks, until the proportions are about right. At this size, it's not going to be perfect, but it can be pretty close. Now I'm just going to make those same changes to the next few lines, and I am going to stop to show you can make a variable thickness where it gets wider or smaller, but it doesn't really matter in this case because we're already as small as we can go. You can also change the nibs at the start and the end. So if I just make that rounded, you can see how nicely that sits on the line that comes before it. It just kind of gives it a nice rounded edge right at the start there. And I'm just going to make that same change across the next couple. Now, as I'm adding each of these lines, you can see that there's a dimensionality beginning to form. Each line is stacked on top of the other, and it looks like the windows are receding back in space as opposed to just sitting kind of in a flat grid. And that's going to be a really big, important part of digitizing and embroidery, is just building dimensionality. So I'm not just going into this design with no plan. I've planned this out. I know exactly how I want all of the lines to sit on top of each other, and I'm going in and adding those lines in that order. All right, now that I have all of those lines for the windows on top of the orange, I can just click on that last one I just did and scroll all the way up and hold shift and click, and now I can select all of those and then add the satin stitch on top of all of them. That's a lot easier than trying to circle all of them, especially when we have a bunch of shapes underneath. And I just want to show you an example of what I mean by this dimensionality, whereas if I shift the order of those last two lines I did, which is proving difficult in this finicky program, you really got to make sure you click bottom and then bring it to the top. You can see how this line ends up going behind it, and I just lose some of that dimension. It's not receding as nicely as I would like. So I'm just going to change those background, get them in the order that I want, and we can see how these windows are sitting. If we want to compare it to the image before, you can see they're not exactly lined up. I might want to do some more fiddling, get this, to the left more so we don't lose those smaller shapes just to the right of it. There's probably some other adjustments I want to make, like I don't love the rounded nib at the start here, so I might change that to a normal start, but then that's kind of flat. That's not exactly how I want it either, so I'll actually change it to pointed, and that's looking a little bit better, especially if we get it lined up more with where the orange begins. And now I'm just going to do the same to all of the other lines that finish at the end of the orange shape, just changing those nibs to a pointed end so they sit kind of nicely on that shape. And now I'm going to make sure I have that last line selected and go back to draw with points so I can start getting the outlines around the green done. And again, we're just command clicking all the way around just to make this line. Instead of doing smaller lines like I did with the windows, I'm actually going to make this first line around the overhang just one large one. And now what's nice is that as soon as I hit the satin stitch, it's actually remembered all of the settings from the lines that came before, so I don't actually have to make any adjustments, and I can just go into adding all of those pillars, which are going to be their own separate lines, and I can just click, shift click, and then add those satin stitches to all of them, and then make a few adjustments to make sure they end right at the end of the green. And now you can watch me being a little perfectionist as I make all of these tiny little adjustments to make sure everything's sitting exactly how I want it, that the lines for the windows are kind of meeting just a little bit on top of each other and then not going beyond where the green begins, making sure the tops of those pillars meet at the very top of that overhang. It's really up to you how much of a perfectionist you want to be. Some of these changes aren't going to be noticeable, and I mean, I'm really liking the way it's looking right now. Everything's kind of going in a direction. There's a lot of dimension. One thing I do want to change is I want to actually make these pillars, two of these pillars, a little thicker, because if you think about it, perspective, things that are closer to you appear closer, appear a little larger. So I'm just going to make these two, the ones that would be closer to you if you're actually standing from the building, just a little bit wider, just giving the impression of a little more perspective. Because in the end, that's what embroidery is all about, just making it dimensional, making it pop. And of course, now that I've done that, I want to fiddle around just a bit more, giving those getting rid of those pointed nibs just so it sits a little neater on the bottom, and I think that looks pretty good. All right, I think that's all I'm going to show for today. We've gone over a lot of information and now have a solid design to work from. The next steps are going to be doing a test stitch out to see how everything is actually going to fit together once we add thread and tension into the mix. So be sure to stick around for part 2.